What if I told you that right now, millions of people are living with a debilitating condition that's so misunderstood, many of them don't even know that they have it? That condition is obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. I'm Dr. Patrick McGrath, the Chief Clinical Officer of NoCD. And in the 25 years I've been treating OCD, I've met so many people who are suffering from the condition in silence, unaware of just what it was. OCD can create overwhelming anxiety and fear around what you value most, make you question your identity, beliefs, and morals, and drive you to perform mentally and physically draining compulsions or rituals. Over my career, I've seen just how devastating OCD can be when it's left untreated. But help is available. That's where NoCD comes in. NoCD is the world's largest virtual therapy provider for obsessive compulsive disorder. Our licensed therapists are trained in exposure and response prevention therapy, a specialized treatment proven to be incredibly effective for OCD. So visit nocd.com to schedule a free 15-minute call with our team. That's nocd.com.
Out here, it's not only the amazing views, but the way time stretches out a little longer. How laughter bellows louder among friends, and how the breeze hits just right at the summit. With All Trails, you can discover and experience the best of nature, with over 450,000 trails worldwide and navigation right at your fingertips. Find your outside with All Trails. Download the free app today and find your next outdoor adventure.
Hi, and welcome again to the Explain History podcast. And yesterday we looked at part one of the Battle of the Ebro, the consequential final act of the Spanish Civil War that seals the Republic's fate. And we looked at the motivations of Negrin's government and what it was seeking to achieve, why it sends 80,000 men across the Ebro River in this last desperate bid to halt the advance of the fascist generals, whilst the country had been divided in two. And Madrid kind of holds out, but much of central Spain has already been conquered by the insurrection. And how the government hoped that this would lead a success at the Ebro, or at least a kind of evidence that they were taking the fight to the enemy, would inspire Britain and France particularly to drop the arms embargo and to finally get behind an anti-fascist government in Spain. And this sadly was not to be. So today we're going to look at the next part of this story. There may be more to say on it, but we'll see what we can get into in half an hour. Okay. So once again, we're looking at Adam Hochschild's Spain in Our Hearts, which is a fantastic book. Despite the initial successes of the Republic in the first hours of the attack, the following day the nationalists counter. Adam Hochschild writes, "The nationalists struck back at the offensive with fierce counterattacks. It was a full week before Alva Bessie took his boots off for the first time." Alva Bessie, one of the American International Brigade members. "Even when sleeping. More than 140 nationalist bombers and dive bombers were unleashed, not to mention 100 fighters that strafed concentrations of troops as they bunched up to cross the Ebro. At times, the lines of trucks waiting to traverse the few floating bridges large enough for them stretched back several miles, making them inviting targets. Then Franco's engineers opened upriver dams in the Pyrenees, and the resulting floods swept away some of the lighter pontoon bridges. 2 weeks into the offensive, Louis Fisher visited the troops in the Republican bridgehead. For the diminishing number of correspondents in Spain, however, it was no longer an easy drive to the front line and then back to the hotel, as had been the case in Madrid. To avoid nationalist bombers, he had to travel at night. The riverbank and the river beaches were pocked with deep bomb holes and sometimes filled with water, Fisher wrote. The engineers laboured up to their waist in river, fastening new tow ropes and replacing broken pontoons. The work proceeded in complete darkness, lest light attract hostile bombers. Fisher began searching for Americans. Each time our driver flashed on a dim light to avoid hitting somebody, the soldiers yelled, "Apagar la luz." But at last we heard New Yorkese and Chicagoese in the Spanish blackout. Men who had been in battle since the first day of the offensive. 13 days of constant combat without undressing, without bathing, sleeping on rocks and hard ground. He slept the rest of the night in the back seat of a car. And the next morning we found the Americans in an olive grove. And when they got up, there was nothing to eat or drink, not even water. And one could see them massaging the insides of their mouths with their tongues. So these are kind of crisis conditions for an army. And it's incredible that the morale of the International Brigadiers, the American Brigades, and the British and the Canadians and the Poles and everybody else lasted for as long as it did. After talking to Alva Bessie and others, Fisher headed back to Barcelona. Usually one was guided by the trucks. If a truck ahead of you stopped with a jerk and its occupants dashed out into the fields, you knew they'd sighted a plane. As we approached a spot where a side road intersected our main highway, I noticed that a soldier and a boy who had been sitting on a culvert quickly jumped and ran. We threw open the doors and bolted. We lay in the stinking ditch by the side of the road. A nationalist plane dropped 4 bombs, one after another, but curiously none of them exploded. The next day, Fisher mentioned this to Negrin over lunch. The Prime Minister told him it was common. We've opened dud bombs made by Franco in Portugal, in which the working men inserted notes saying, "Friend, this bomb won't hurt you." There were many similar accounts, certainly too many all to be true, but such stories provided small flashes of hope in a dark time. On the Ebro battlefront, the summer heat was overwhelming. One August day saw record temperatures of 98 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade and 134 in the sun. Many men had no helmets. Bessie wrote, "I showed the Spanish boys how to put leaves inside their caps to ward off sunstroke, but worse than the heat was the lack of water. The men ran back and forth a dozen times with loaded canteens, but no one got enough. We were wet from head to foot with sweat. In addition, the rocky terrain made digging trenches or foxholes nearly impossible. You'd run a diamond drill trying to dig a hole. You'd ruin a diamond drill trying to dig a hole. Remember one man who'd been a miner. Digging a grave was no less difficult. For many a Lincoln, burial simply meant having rocks piled on top of what was left of them. Food appeared erratically and was odd at best. Fried bacalhau, which is codfish, very salty, Bessie remembered, and a petrified sort of blood sausage that was more gristle than meat. The Americans' old nemesis, diarrhea, returned in full force. I could hit a dime at 10 meters, one man joked. Sometimes, to rub in the disparity in the rival army's food and supplies, loudspeakers in the nationalist trenches broadcast their daily menu. The American International Brigadiers were treated with immense suspicion when they returned home to America. Bear in mind, of course, that within living memory for these men, there had been a Red Scare in the USA, and the returning anti-fascist fighters who had come back to America, having fought in an overseas conflict that was not endorsed or sanctioned by the US government, fell foul of the FBI when they returned. Those returning at New York were kind of harassed by the New York police and immigration authorities, and were figures of immense suspicion. And many of them mentioned in sort of local newspapers where they lived. And it was a conflict that lots of people in America, didn't understand. They didn't know what was going on in Spain, or see what it had to do with them, which is, not uncommon. So these guys who went through these sorts of hardships were really put through the ringer when they went home, those that survived. The attrition rates are enormous. I think about a quarter of them all died, which, even if you compare that with the First World War, the Allied powers in the First World War, those sorts of losses weren't incurred. So Adam Hochschild writes, his side outgunned, the skies full of German and Italian planes, Bessie still kept a shrewd eye on his own emotions, an ability he shared with Orwell. At such times, the tension is intolerable, he wrote, of an afternoon, when his unit was sheltering in a pitiful 2-foot trench scratched out of a stony hill crest, waiting nervously to go into action. Machine gun fire rattled nearby. Your mouth dries up and you spit cotton. Your stomach clenches and unclenches. Your bowels writhe and there's a deep ache in your chest. You look around and you see other men sitting, talking calmly, showing no fear in their faces, acting as though they were on a picnic in the woods. And you realize with astonishment that if you could see yourself, this is exactly what you would see. For men do not like to show their fear in the presence of other men. They put on a good act. The new Spanish recruits filling the battalion's ranks failed badly when they came under fire. They could not be urged, threatened, kicked, or shot. 2 of them were, into advancing. This was not surprising, for unlike the American volunteers, the Spaniards were draftees. They must have been apprehensive at landing in the International Brigades, which were widely known in battle after battle for being thrown into the forefront of the deadliest fighting. The experience of the International Brigades to begin with is really, really terrifying. These are guys that most of them don't have any combat experience. They have a limited amount of training. They have old equipment, and they are flung into kind of Stalingrad level fighting, where there was precious little artillery or air support, no air support, and they were slaughtered. The British and American and Canadian battalions particularly sustain enormous losses in the International Brigade. And when they start to be filled out by Spanish recruits, it's an indication that the losses were irreplaceable. It became harder and harder for volunteers to make it to Spain, and for the level of recruitment declines when the realities of the war become clearer and clearer.
What if I told you that right now, millions of people are living with a debilitating condition that's so misunderstood, many of them don't even know that they have it? That condition is obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. I'm Dr. Patrick McGrath, the Chief Clinical Officer of NoCD. And in the 25 years I've been treating OCD, I've met so many people who were suffering from the condition in silence, unaware of just what it was. OCD can create overwhelming anxiety and fear around what you value most, make you question your identity, beliefs, and morals, and drive you to perform mentally and physically draining compulsions or rituals. Over my career, I've seen just how devastating OCD can be when it's left untreated. But help is available. That's where NoCD comes in. NoCD is the world's largest virtual therapy provider for obsessive compulsive disorder. Our licensed therapists are trained in exposure and response prevention therapy, a specialized treatment proven to be incredibly effective for OCD. So visit nocd.com to schedule a free 15-minute call with our team. That's nocd.com.
Epic views, waterfall mists, summits, sunsets. It's all better outside. And with All Trails, you can discover the best of nature with over 450,000 trails around the world. Download the free app today and find your next adventure.
Federal missions demand efficiency. At GDIT, efficiency means streamlining government operations, automating citizen services, and saving the government over $1 billion a year detecting and preventing fraud. We bring proven AI, cloud, and software development solutions to the forefront of driving efficiencies, delivering savings of up to 40%. Because at GDIT, efficiency isn't just possible, it's built in. Learn more at gdit.com.
As Bessie watched reinforcements arrive, it was clear that the government was down to the bottom of the manpower barrel. Men too old or young, ex-convicts, former deserters. Nationalist aircraft were dropping leaflets urging them to surrender. In Franco's Spain, justice reigns. There is abundance, peace, and liberty. No one is hungry. Come over to your brothers. Of the leaflets, one American commented, "Ain't got no Union label." Some Spanish soldiers, however, did desert. But for Americans, there was no abundance, peace, or liberty on the other side. When some 40 members of the Lincoln and Washington Battalion, 14 of them American, were taken prisoner in September, nationalist troops marched them to the rear, where an officer heard men talking English. When an officer heard men talking English, he stopped the march, separated out the Americans, and ordered them to be machine gunned. The International Brigades were treated particularly harshly when caught by the nationalists because they were seen as kind of foreign fighters. They had come to Spain interfering in things that were of no concern to them, and they were prolonging the war and were summarily executed. The Republican Army had received new anti-aircraft guns. But, Bessie wrote, we had so few that 75 planes merely sailed with exasperating ease through their sparse fire. And then when 10 of ours appeared, they had to run a gauntlet of fire that blackened the sky for hundreds of acres. It was heartbreaking. Intense shelling filled the air, not just with shrapnel, but also with chips of rock blasted from the mountainsides. Bessie found a different sort of horror when the shelling paused. After all these hours, 8 in all, when you tried to walk, rising from the narrow niche in which you'd been lying all day, it was almost impossible. Your legs refused to obey your mind. You had to look at them to try to assure yourself they were there and will them to move. Trying to relieve yourself some distance from the shelter, ready to jump and run at the sound of a distant gun, you tottered on your feet and fell back in your excrement. You wondered how much of this it would be possible to bear. One American sergeant clenched a short stick between his teeth to keep them from chattering. When his best friend was wounded and lost an eye, Bessie inherited his pistol, sticky with blood, and soon after got word that he had died in hospital. A nationalist shell hit a food truck and the men had no food that night. A month after they crossed the river, 768 men in the battalion had been reduced to 380. So there's 400, nearly 400 men dead. A visiting journalist brought word that Nazi Germany had mobilized huge numbers of troops on the Czech and French frontiers for maneuvers. And obviously, we know what happens there. The steady trickle of news, writes Adam Hochschild, reaching the Lincolns made it clear that France and Britain, led by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, were eager to soothe Hitler. This crushed any hope of Western arms sales to the Republic. Mr. Chamberlain is going to sell the Czechs down the river, a friend of Bessie's at the front told him in August 1938. Mark my words. In September, Bessie was at the 15th Brigade headquarters in the Ebro bridgehead when some of the details of concessions Chamberlain was offering came through. The news from Europe was worse than ever, with England and France agreeing to the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia and presenting a plan of compromise. Hitler would gain large areas of the country, and the plan would include the usual guarantees of her frontiers by England, France, Germany, and Italy. The murderers were guaranteeing to respect the corpse. The Czech crisis escalated throughout the month. On September the 12th, Hitler gave a fiery speech demanding self-determination for Czechoslovakia's ethnic Germans. 3 days later, Chamberlain rushed to confer with the Führer at his Alpine retreat in Berchtesgaden. A week later, the British Prime Minister paid a second visit to Hitler, whose demands only escalated. Finally, on September the 29th, came the Munich conference, in which the leaders of Europe's major nations, sitting in a semicircle of armchairs around a large fireplace in the city's palatial new Nazi headquarters, essentially dismembered Czechoslovakia. Others gave Hitler what he wanted. The others gave Hitler what he wanted. 10,000 square miles of Czech territory containing some 3.5 million people, some of whom were not even ethnic Germans. Although Chamberlain returned to London, his striped trousers and starched wing collar, to claim that he had achieved peace in our time, it was at an enormous cost-free victory for Hitler. Czechoslovakia's fate was all the more poignant because, almost alone amongst the states of Eastern Europe, it had been a thriving democracy. Franco promptly sent Chamberlain his warmest congratulations for the magnificent effort for preserving the peace in Europe. Virginia Cowles, covering the crisis, found Prague chilled by an air of menace, with the centuries-old buildings looking sad and grey beneath an overcast sky. The country's president announced the results of the Munich conference over loudspeakers in to huge sombre crowds gathered in Wenceslas Square. One reporter brought a Czech secretary to translate for the small group of foreign correspondents watching. The broadcast was a short one, Cowles wrote, telling the nation of the final decision to partition the country. Then the pathetic words, "Our state will not be the smallest. There are smaller states than we shall be." The Czech stenographer put down her pencil, buried her head in her hands and wept. So that's the kind of part of the wider international context of the Battle of the Ebro. And it obviously, the Munich Agreement kind of skewers everything Negrin and his government are trying to achieve. There is now going to be no war in 1938, no anti-fascist war in 1938. And as far as they're concerned, no anti-fascist war at all. That Spain's defenders are not coming. And the problem for the Republic is it's running out of time. Nobody knows that the war will begin the following year. And the Republic hasn't got a year to wait. So what of Stalin, the other kind of party in Spain, looking at very intently at what's happening? Well, he was very interested in Munich, of course. Stalin was part of Stalin's worldview was that this was a meeting to which he was not invited. It was a meeting that decided the fate of a Soviet ally in Europe, Czechoslovakia, and it was a meeting where the Western Allies and Hitler came to a cosy, friendly compromise. And in doing so, it was Stalin suspected, and he was right to suspect this, that the British and the French were hoping that Hitler would make his war against the Soviet Union first. So, Adam Hochschild says, someone who keenly watched the making of the Munich Agreement was Joseph Stalin, who, for all his vengeance against imaginary enemies, knew that he faced a real one in Hitler. He now realised that Britain and France would never step in to prevent a Franco victory. Mussolini's submarines continued to make it dangerous to ship Soviet arms to Spain. Stalin began to lose interest in the war, and people noticed that Spanish news no longer ran on the front pages of Pravda and Izvestia.
What if I told you that right now, millions of people are living with a debilitating condition that's so misunderstood, many of them don't even know that they have it? That condition is obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. I'm Dr. Patrick McGrath, the Chief Clinical Officer of NoCD. And in the 25 years I've been treating OCD, I've met so many people who are suffering from the condition in silence, unaware of just what it was. OCD can create overwhelming anxiety and fear around what you value most, make you question your identity, beliefs, and morals, and drive you to perform mentally and physically draining compulsions or rituals. Over my career, I've seen just how devastating OCD can be when it's left untreated. But help is available. That's where NoCD comes in. NoCD is the world's largest virtual therapy provider for obsessive compulsive disorder. Our licensed therapists are trained in exposure and response prevention therapy, a specialized treatment proven to be incredibly effective for OCD. So visit nocd.com to schedule a free 15-minute call with our team. That's nocd.com.
Out here, it's not only the amazing views, but the way time stretches out a little longer and how the breeze hits just right at the summit. With All Trails, you can discover nature's best with over 450,000 trails around the world. Download the free app today.
It had been a year since the dictator had recalled his ambassador to Spain in order to have him shot, and he had never bothered to appoint a new one. Stalin gradually withdrew most of the Russian and Eastern European officers he'd lent to the Republic's military, and for good measure, he continued to order many of them to be executed. Amongst those recalled to the Soviet Union and never seen again was the 15th Brigade commander, the opera singing Colonel Vladimir Kopich. The Soviet military personnel in the Republic, once close to 1,000, would drop to a quarter of that by the end of 1938. Convinced that Britain and France were unlikely to join with the Soviet Union in the alliance against Germany that he wanted, Stalin began to pursue a different strategy. Before the end of the year was over, the newspaper of the Socialist Party, USA, the party to which Lois and Charles Orr, International Brigadiers in Lincoln's, had belonged, would carry a prescient headline, "Will Hitler and Stalin make a deal?" So this was, by the end of 1938, already what Stalin was considering. In Spain, Prime Minister Juan Negrin and his cabinet knew that the majority of the International Brigade volunteers had now been killed or wounded, and that the communist parties around the world were no longer recruiting more. So the government took a modest chance, hoping against hope that by publicly withdrawing the internationals, it might pressure the democracies to insist that Franco do the same with Hitler and Mussolini's soldiers and airmen. In a dramatic speech before the League of Nations in Geneva, Negrin announced that all members of the International Brigades would be pulled out of combat and would leave Spain. Fearing a collapse of discipline before the men could be withdrawn in an orderly fashion, some brigade officers tried in vain to prevent word from reaching the front lines. Alva Bessi heard the news on a day when a bomb blast from a German Junkers knocked him flat. He and his fellow soldiers knew that this gamble was not of high stakes, not one of high stakes, for only a few thousand exhausted internationals were left. Of the several hundred Americans still in Spain, many were in hospitals. Only about 80 were at the front. 3 days after Negrin's announcement, having just retreated in bloody disarray from the devastating nationalist artillery barrage, the remaining Americans in the combat zone left it for good, crossing the Ebro River for the last time on the crude planks of a pontoon bridge. And of course, there weren't just American international brigadiers there; they were international brigadiers from across Europe, Britain, and beyond. So the failure at the Ebro, I mean, in some ways militarily, it was written in this always written really. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and it was a desperate gamble to show the British and the French that the Republic had a fight in it and they were worth backing. And of course, the British and the French disregarded that. And Britain and France's culpability at Munich, we often think of it as the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, that it's betrayal, capitulation to fascism, and it certainly is. And Chamberlain, whilst he viewed himself as buying time for Britain, bought it at the expense of the Czechs, but also at the expense of Spain as well. This is one of the aspects of that period of time that we rarely address. And Munich and the Battle of Ebro, they rhyme, you know. They go in concert with one another as concepts. Anyway. I'll leave you there, but check out Spain in Our Hearts. It's a wonderful book, and I'll catch you on the next podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.
When you think of skyrocketing brands like Aloe, Allbirds, or Skims, it's easy to credit their success to great products, sleek branding, and brilliant marketing. But here's the overlooked secret. The real magic lies in the engine behind the scenes, the business powering their business. For millions of brands, that engine is Shopify, making selling seamless for them and shopping effortless for us. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Aloe Yoga uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/retail, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/retail to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/retail.
It's the July 4th sale at Bray & Scarf, going on now with huge savings throughout the store. Save up to 40% on GE Profile and Cafe appliances. Or step up to luxury with free installation on select Monogram appliances. Special financing is available. Shop local and save this July 4th at Bray & Scarf. Visit any of our convenient locations or go to brayandscarf.com, where it doesn't cost more to get more.